Hi, I'm Gabriel Deverens from the Walkable Ottawa podcast. We are a homegrown initiative focused on transitioning Ottawa's neighborhoods into more walkable communities. We interview key stakeholders, industry leaders, and community members to see how we can build a better Ottawa of tomorrow. On today's episode, we have Rosaline Hill. Rosaline is an architect and development consultant, but also the founding member of Walkable Ottawa. On today's conversation, we touch base on the origins of Walkable Ottawa, as well as why now is a time to transition our existing mature neighborhoods into more walkable communities. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hi, Rosaline. How are you?
I am good. How are you, Gabriel?
I'm good. This is really exciting. This is our first episode of the Walkable Ottawa podcast, and I'm really grateful to have you here.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so I thought we maybe get started in terms of maybe finding out a bit more in terms of who is Rosaline Hill?
Who am I? Well, I'm an architect. I'm a mom.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an urban cyclist. I live and work in Ottawa.
Okay, very exciting. Yeah, and I guess in terms of your background, in terms of as an architect, how have you kind of seen your involvement, or how have you seen the city grow over the last little while?
Well, maybe I should start by saying I arrived in Ottawa in 2001. Before that, I lived in the Toronto area and went to school in Waterloo. And so since then, I have seen the city growing, but particularly from the lens of my work, I've seen the existing urban neighborhoods of the city being intensified and beginning to transition into sort of their new phase of life as the original developments are starting to be refreshed with new infill.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you speak a bit more about your office and some of the work that you do?
Well, I started my office in 2010 doing infill housing. So started off with just little infill projects like infill singles and semis.
Okay.
And we've grown over the years so that now we're doing all sorts of housing developments up to and including 8-story apartment buildings. So a real mix, but most of our work is housing.
Mm-hmm.
And so a real focus on that niche, but particularly because it's a really difficult niche to do well. So it's important for us to
what makes you say that it's a difficult niche to do well?
Well, there are a lot of regulations around how housing is to be built. So
Mm-hmm.
beyond just building code, there are a lot of zoning regulations and planning regulations that dictate what can be built and how it's built. And in order to serve my clients who are developers looking to earn profit through housing development,
Mm-hmm.
You have to really understand the fine-grained details of all of those regulations and approval systems in order to do the job well.
Okay, so I guess your average client would be someone who has maybe bought a house that's older, needs to be maybe torn down, and we're increasing the density of the existing property.
Yeah. So there are people who are speculating on land by buying an older building that's at end of life. So it's either very small or it's uninsulated or run down or whatnot. They come to me to find out what would be the best thing to build in that location in order to make a profit and build a project that they'd be proud to have their name on. And so one of the first things that I do with my clients is help them to analyze and understand what's the potential for the development on any given property, based on the regulations that come to bear on that site.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of wear two hats. I am an architect, but also a development consultant. And that role as a development consultant in the housing industry is really important right now, particularly as we kind of shift gears a little bit as a city and start to think a little bit differently about housing and what's possible and what's best for our city.
Yeah, because I guess most of the housing stock in the city is quite older, and we're getting, like you said, to the point where the buildings are at life expectancy. Because I guess there was a big rush of housing built after the Second World War until 50s, 60s, and now those buildings are becoming 40, 50, 60, 80 years old, depending on which mature neighborhood that you're looking at. So, and now we're here in the podcast studio. And what has kind of brought you to kind of being the founding member of Walkable Ottawa? How did that all come to be?
It started in the context of my work, understanding how neighborhoods evolve. For the last, decade really, the length of time that I've had my own practice, I've been volunteering with a group of industry members who've been advocating for positive change to the regulations that around infill housing.
Hmm.
And that volunteer work has been very frustrating and generally fruitless. The city and neighborhood groups and industry groups have been trying to understand how to make neighborhood intensification better
Hmm.
by tinkering with what we've got. And there's a great sense of dissatisfaction on all fronts and frustration. And so, as someone who understands the mechanisms that produce development patterns, I thought, hang on, I need to take some time here and understand, why are we where we are now?
Hmm.
And can we make other choices? Are we just destined to continue down the path that we're on? Or can we make other choices and choose a different direction for our neighborhoods? And so I started analyzing development patterns and discovered that transitioning neighborhoods to become walkable was really key to solving a whole lot of problems within our neighborhoods. Not just environmental challenges, but challenges to do with housing typology and meeting housing need, and addressing some of the social dynamics within neighborhoods. So all of the pieces really come together around the idea of what it takes to transition our existing urban neighborhoods from what they are now into walkable communities, fully walkable communities. And so when I kind of realized that that's such an important piece of the puzzle, I felt a certain responsibility to push that forward as best I could and to share the information that I have. On top of that, I saw that we won't be able to achieve walkable neighborhoods. We won't ever get there if we don't collaborate, because none of us have all the answers.
Hmm.
So you've been a member of a community association. I think you were head of your community association, and I think you can appreciate how complex neighborhood issues are and how they can't really be understood until you get different stakeholders together talking and working it through.
Yeah, and I guess we're at a really interesting juncture in Ottawa's history because the city's been working on this for a while. They're coming out with a draft of their new official plan, so it's kind of this opportune time for an increased collaboration between private sector, industry leaders, community associations, and the city, so we can kind of really figure out what the Ottawa of tomorrow will look like. Because I guess it's the new official plan will be making decisions for the next decades to come in terms
Right.
of how we rebuild our city, which is largely built of older buildings, like you said, that are at end of life.
Yeah, well, and that's not to say that we can't be keeping many of those older buildings. Lots
Hmm.
of them can be kept, the insulation values can be upgraded, but it's important to take opportunities where we can to intensify our neighborhoods, because we can't achieve, or we can't transition to walkability without having more density.
Hmm.
So engaging in this discussion about walkability right now, as you say, it's a critical moment. The city has been working on it quite diligently, but they don't have the resources to model the potential changes over time. And the kind of collaboration that I've been engaging in through Walkable Ottawa has been really invaluable in understanding more clearly and more carefully, more deliberately, the interdependencies of the different pieces of the walkability puzzle, with the help of community members and industry members and members of Ecology Ottawa.
Hmm. So can you maybe speak about that gentle relationship between density and walkability?
Yeah, that's an important relationship to understand, because some neighborhoods already are walkable to a degree.
Such
And
as?
the Glebe, for example.
Hmm.
And I guess it's important to be clear about what we mean by walkability, right? So some people, when they mean walkable, they mean, if you make a neighborhood walkable, you have less cars and more walking paths. But that's not a definition that I find satisfying, because from the perspective of the housing development industry, if you just have less cars and more walking paths, you have more frustrated people
Mm-hmm.
who have trouble getting around and don't have the things they need in their neighborhood.
Right.
So the definition that we're using at Walkable Ottawa for a walkable neighborhood is a neighborhood where you can walk to the most of the things you need in your daily life,
Mm-hmm.
and your walk is enjoyable. And it's important to really set the bar high on that definition, because if we don't get our neighborhoods to that level of walkability, we're never going to change from our car culture. We are very embedded in our car habits, right?
Yeah, in Ottawa especially too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So shifting from our car culture means setting the bar high for walkability and transitioning our neighborhoods.
Right.
In order to have all of those pieces
Mm-hmm.
that are necessary to have a neighborhood shift to that level of walkability,
Mm-hmm.
it means you've got to have small shops, you've got to have a lot more walkways and parks. You really need the neighborhood to become complete.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't draw neighborhoods from where they are now to that level of completeness with the population levels as they are now.
Mm-hmm.
So shops are the best example of that, because we can provide space for small commercial facilities in neighborhoods, along small commercial veins where neighbors feel it's appropriate to have those. But we won't actually attract entrepreneurs to
Mm-hmm.
those shop fronts unless there's enough people walking by and wanting to shop in those locations. So by increasing the density in a neighborhood, we provide customers to future small commercial facilities. So there's a balanced relationship there between density and drawing all the things into a neighborhood that will make it complete.
Mm-hmm. And how much so we know Ottawa has changed quite a bit since they've introduced the LRT system. We have a fully operational train system. We've seen a lot of construction around those LRT stations specifically. And I guess now over the next few years, some of that density will be transferring itself, or there'll be a bit more of a focus to being around those LRT stations. So there's an opportunity to create a bit more density.
Yeah, and the city's been talking a lot about building density around nodes and corridors.
Mm-hmm.
But if we set our goal if our goal is walkable neighborhoods, which is the best choice environmentally, and we can talk more about that
Mm-hmm.
later. But if we set our goal to be walkable neighborhoods, then intensifying only at nodes and corridors doesn't get us there. Existing neighborhoods, if they're going to transition to become walkable, we need density throughout existing neighborhoods. And so that we call that form of density, gentle density, missing middle density. There's a number of different terms for that, but it's in the form of smaller multi-unit or even smaller single unit, but smaller buildings within the neighborhood fabric, buildings that are of the same size as the infill that we see today
Mm-hmm.
coming into those neighborhoods, but allowing different types of unit mixes within those buildings. And then also allowing for opportunities that don't exist today. For example, building a small house in an existing side yard. So right now our regulations aren't set up to allow any of those scenarios that I
So
just
given the
described.
existing regulations, what trends do you see based on how the existing zoning bylaw is written? Is there a specific type of housing that's being built?
Yeah.
And does that type of market or housing meet market demand?
Yeah. So if we carry on the trajectory we're on, an awful lot of our neighborhoods will receive large singles and semis
Mm-hmm.
as they are now. And they are generally, people would call them oversized.
Okay.
So they're aimed at a higher market. They're large. They have high level finishes.
Mm-hmm.
So they're targeted to the higher end purchaser. And there's not a lot of mix that's going into our neighborhoods right now. The smaller houses that are being removed from those neighborhoods because they're prime for redevelopment, often those are the houses in the neighborhood that were the most affordable to live in
Mm-hmm.
before the infill took place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's shifting the demographic within neighborhoods, and that isn't a demographic that matches our community's demographic. So our community demographic within Ottawa is very diverse, with a mix of incomes, mix of household sizes, and in particular, we do have a lot of smaller households. So we're infilling our neighborhoods with larger units at a higher price point rather than meeting market demand for that
And have you
variety.
seen a change between the number of people that have been living in the houses since, let's say, that house built in 1950 versus the average family now in 2020?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because neighborhoods that were built in 1950, the average house in a neighborhood in the 1950s housed 8 people. And
Wow.
those people were not necessarily all of one nuclear family. Sometimes it was extended family members. Often there was a boarder in the house because it was uncommon for single professionals or single workers to live on their own. They would board with a family.
Mm-hmm.
So those homes that held 8 people now, in Ottawa, they hold now 2.4 people.
Wow.
So our neighborhoods, even as we add singles and semis to our neighborhoods, we're intensifying a little bit, but we're nowhere close to reaching the densities that we saw in those neighborhoods back in the 1950s. So when we talk about the gentle density required to bring us to our goal of walkable neighborhoods, we're actually really just returning to the densities that we used to have in those same neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the number of units.
In terms of the number of
But
people.
not then, okay.
The number of people. Yeah. So it's a different number of units because we now choose to live in smaller house groups. We're not choosing to live 8 people to a house. So
Mhm.
therefore we need more smaller units in order to meet the demographic demand of our households.
So practically speaking, I guess what you're speaking about is like I went to school in Montreal. I lived in a neighborhood called the Plateau. So there was a bunch of low-rise apartments, 3 stories high, an apartment on the ground floor, second floor, third floor, and it seemed like that was primarily the housing, if not only the housing choice that was there. But in contrast to Ottawa, it's a mostly car-centric environment. There's less of these neighborhoods of 3-story walk-ups like there is in downtown Montreal. Are those the kinds of options that you're kind of proposing or looking or think the city needs in order to meet those intensity measures?
That's a good example. And Montreal is an interesting comparison because downtown Montreal does have a lot of multi-use buildings that are quite lovely, lining
Mhm.
streets. However, if you've ever driven around other neighborhoods in Montreal, you'll see the same kind of sprawling effect that we have here in Ottawa. So there are some lessons we can learn from Montreal in some of those multi-unit buildings in the downtown of Montreal,
Mhm.
but also we can see in Montreal some of the same challenges that we face here. When we think, though, about those Montreal walk-up buildings, we do have a slightly different building code in Ontario. So some of those exit stair scenarios aren't going to work here.
Okay.
But the general idea of having multi-unit buildings spread out within a neighborhood, I think, is the important piece of the puzzle here. And we've done a lot of 3D modeling in order to understand what kind of impact that would have on a neighborhood and how it would look.
Okay.
It's actually surprising how little it visually can change as a result of this kind of intensification.
Because I guess that's a concern from a resident who's here. They can see gentrification coming to the neighborhood. They see these larger semis being built. But I guess by the 3D modeling that you've done, it kind of shows people a bit more of a visual representation of what their neighborhood of tomorrow can look like. And I see you've brought a few slides providing a few examples. Can you maybe speak about the slide that you have up?
Sure. So this is a slide with an image that was produced at the end of a study that we did with a group of people in Overbrook to understand how their little piece of neighborhood could transition over time. And it shows a neighborhood street that has doubled in density and become walkable with reduced driving space to be shared with cars and bikes. Reducing the amount of paving on a street like this makes it safer for cyclists because cars will move more slowly. We've added in a sidewalk, and you can see the multi-unit housing types on either side of the street. But I think it's more useful to look at actually if we see the street in progression throughout time. So this is the starting point of that image. This is actually a 3D model of a combination of streets in the Overbrook Vanier area. We combined streets so that we get a street that was a good example that showed the kind of variety that's there. And these houses are modeled on actual houses that exist in the neighborhood. And over time, we would propose that, number one, we need to get some quick and dirty walking paths in there. So this is a solution for a quick walking path. It's inexpensive for the city to install, and it's a 4 seasons walking path, which means that it's plowed with no additional snow clearing cost to the city. And it would get the neighborhood quickly on track to have appropriate space for people to walk. But on the right-hand side, you can see I've already switched in one of the newer housing typologies on the right-hand side, and you can see the gentleman sitting on his front porch there. Okay. So that's a building that is the same size and proportion of other buildings down the street, other homes down the street, but could contain anywhere from 2 to 6 dwelling units, depending on the size of the dwelling units. Mm-hmm. And then if we move forward again in time, this is the image you saw before. We've introduced more dwelling units on the left-hand side as well. And this street is now double the density. So that's a kind of density that could begin to support small format commercial close by and tip the neighborhood over into being truly walkable. There's a few other things about this image that are helpful. Our collaborators within the development industry have been great in sharing ideas about how to make this transition actually function. So how do we actually attract the development that we need in order to transition? We need to attract the right kind of new density, and we need to attract that density and those new homeowners or tenants into a neighborhood that's not yet walkable. But we want to be building toward our walkable future. So there's there can be a bit of a chicken and an egg problem in getting that transition to work. So some of the things incorporated in this image are some of the transitional pieces of the puzzle. So on the left, behind the gentleman in the sunglasses, we've allowed space for a neighborhood parking lot, temporary neighborhood parking lot, in order to get us through that. I think you used the term awkward teenage stage of transition. And on the right, you'll see a car parked in front of a house, quite close to the curb. So that use of small driveway or short driveway parking close to the curb can also be a transitional location for parking that can get us through that awkward transition when people still need their cars, but won't for much longer. So it's a great tool to help understand how the neighborhood can transition.
And with these 3D visuals, through Walkable Ottawa, we've collaborated with many organizations. So we've chatted with the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Associations, we've chatted with Ecology Ottawa, we've chatted with the Federation Citizens of Associations. Can you maybe talk about your experiences in terms of speaking with all of the stakeholders who are involved in designing the city and what that process looked like?
The most surprising thing about it, because the groups that you've described are normally not sitting at the same table, right? The most surprising thing about all those conversations is how positive and supportive and collaborative they have all been. I think the pushback that we get sometimes when we talk about change in our neighborhoods comes when people don't have a clear vision or feel that they don't have enough pieces to understand and can see that there are real problems that aren't being solved. But in this scenario where we're asking people to push up their sleeves, join the table and help us really wrestle the details to the ground and understand them, people have been so helpful and interested. Ecology Ottawa, interestingly, we're really delighted to see this 3D modeling because it shows how the neighborhood can transition, and it's lovely. A lot of people anticipate a really unfortunate kind of a change. Yeah. And so to see the images and to see that actually the increased density is really gentle. It's not really very visually impactful, and that the benefits to the community visually are really great. It just makes everything so much easier.
So do you think it's a question of just lack of conversation or lack of collaboration between these few stakeholder groups in terms of reaching consensus? Why hasn't there been any consensus reached between all these 3 different groups?
So there's been, over the past many years, an awful lot of finger pointing and blaming. and frustration, and a sense that the development patterns that we see unfolding around us are outside of our control. A lot of people have blamed developers for making the choices of what gets built and how and where and when. And so to be able to pull apart the mechanisms of change and explain them and describe them to people and ask for people's input to bring us to a new future pattern. It's just very encouraging, I think, for people and empowering for people to see that the tools are there for us to make decisions together and to set a new course moving ahead. I've got some more 3D models to share of small commercial veins in the neighborhood. So those images that I've just shown you moving forward through the transition, this is a 2.5-story neighborhood street that I've shown you.
Mm-hmm.
Another important element of a walkable neighborhood is the commercial veins, small commercial veins that would need to run through a neighborhood. Because the idea is that everybody in a neighborhood should be able to walk to everything that they need. So right now, most people in most of our neighborhoods aren't within walking distance of a grocery store. Those of us who are often have to brave the gigantic parking lot in front of it to make it to the grocery store. So in order to have the small shops spread throughout the neighborhood that we would need, we're going to have to run commercial veins through neighborhoods. Now, in any given neighborhood, usually residents can point out where that would be most appropriate, where there has been a shop in the past, or maybe there is still one little corner store somewhere. Often it's a route that's between two things. So a road that runs between a key feature of your neighborhood and a key transit location in your neighborhood, for example, or something like that. But neighbors and neighborhood associations are great at identifying where those commercial veins ought to be. And there's an example of a street that could become a commercial vein.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with houses taken from our existing architecture in Ottawa. And as this street transitions, this is about 10 years out. Some of the things that need to happen, we definitely need to have complete streets. So there needs to be space on commercial veins where cars are separate from bikes, separate from walking. And then you can see on the left-hand side, the second house along is being used now as some kind of a shop. And it's just been retrofit. But in the foreground on the left, you'll see a new residential building. So it's a multi-unit building that's replaced the previous older home.
Mm-hmm.
And what's important about this new development is that its ground floor space is at the level of the sidewalk.
Okay, so this would be a newer building that was built.
Yeah, I'll just go back one there. So you see this older home
Mm-hmm.
has been torn down and replaced with a new development.
Okay.
But what's important here is that the new development, though it's fully residential, has a ground floor that could one day be converted to commercial.
I see.
So as the neighborhood intensifies, as time goes on, many of these spaces will transition to become commercial space because they can easily.
Mm-hmm.
And so and the infrastructure on a street like this that can be tightened up over time. So whereas in the in-between stage, we just had paint lines designating a bike path, we can have more solid barriers over time. And you'll see in all of these 3D images as well, there's tree planting going on, very deliberate tree planting, so that when we get to the end scenario, which in these slides is assumed to be 25 years out, we have quite a lovely tree canopy overhead in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
That certainly won't happen without deliberate effort and collaborative effort.
And when you say deliberate effort, do you mean specifically finding those streets within a neighborhood fabric that could be transitioned to be local commercial one day?
Absolutely. And I think it's important that community groups are involved in those decisions as well, because they understand their neighborhoods best and they want to be involved. And so locating those commercial veins throughout a neighborhood is important. Also, there are different pattern options for receiving density into neighborhoods.
Such as?
In particular, 2.5-story versus 3.5-story development patterns. So a lot of neighborhoods, I think residents could say without batting an eye that their neighborhood is a 1 to 2.5 story neighborhood and should stay that way. And given that condition, the kinds of gentle density that neighborhood would receive are different than a neighborhood that, like Hintonburg, for example, which is already built. Much of it is built 3 stories. So in that kind of a neighborhood, you could easily say, well, no, 3.5 story development here is appropriate to the context. And in fact, that produces different patterns naturally with the same kind of regulations. The 2.5 story versus the 3.5 story produce a different effect. And so we've 3D modeled those 2 different effects as well. And it would be great to have community members looking at that 3D modeling as much as possible. And that is why we're engaging with community associations as much as we can. So people can understand the different choices that are available, still within the context of walkable neighborhoods.
And I guess one of the other things that you've worked on is the consultation workbook. So through Walkable Ottawa, you put together a consultation workbook to try to collect some of that feedback from neighborhood association residents. How has that experience been?
That was an interesting experience because it was one of the first times that our group worked to get a lot of our material together into one document to share. And we put it into a Google form so that as people worked through the material, they could provide feedback on the as they went through, also allowing people to kind of jump to the material that they found most interesting. And we followed that up with workshops. And the feedback that we got, some of it was affirming. A lot of it was affirming. Some of it was surprising, but very insightful. Okay. So, for example, we really need more benches. I didn't realize how critical benches are to a walkable neighborhood. And in some ways, it's a small thing. I mean, it's relatively simple compared to housing development patterns or commercial veins. Yeah. But it is of particular importance. So we learned quite a bit. We also had the honor of seeing our own 3D modeling through other people's eyes. And that was really helpful to have people reflect back to us what they saw. So it was an interesting experience. And in general, we were affirmed in the work that we're doing. We've fine-tuned our vision, and we've moved ahead in our consultation to kind of the next step, where we're talking specifically with representatives from the Home Builders Association, Ecology Ottawa, and the Federation of Community Associations, in order to put together a position paper that we hope many of these groups will sign on to with us. And then we can really work to ensure that the key pieces of this vision that we share are in our new official plan.
And that collaborative process is encouraging, like you said, in terms of having all of these different perspectives and people getting along all together in one room. And through the first series of consultations, we've had 7 public consultations online with different neighborhood of different typologies based on the patterns in terms of how it came to be. And a few other topical consultations, one on local small businesses, one around the environment. Can you maybe speak about the benefits of creating a city that is more walkable?
Okay, well, why don't we start with the environment? So walkable neighborhoods, a successful walkable neighborhood would mean that the majority of people, though they might have a car, would choose not to use it most of the time. So they might still have a car and they might still drive their car to the campsite or, out to the Gatineaus for a hike or something, or drive to IKEA or to visit relatives on the other end of town. But for their regular daily trips to school, to the grocery store, it would be much more efficient and enjoyable for them to walk.
And is there a certain distance that would be measured whether or not a certain neighborhood is walkable or not?
There are distances that people use. But interestingly, in our consultation, there's been disagreement over those distances. Okay. So I think maybe that's a a conversation that's still ongoing and community specific. Many people will say that if you can walk there in 15 minutes, that's walkable. But of course, people walk at different speeds.
Mm-hmm.
So 15-minute walk is maybe a kilometer.
Okay.
A walkable neighborhood, if the majority of people are only using their cars occasionally, that neighborhood has reduced emissions in a way that is wildly significant.
Mm-hmm.
Those emissions reductions are greater than any other single effort that we could make. You compare that to, say, having that whole neighborhood transition to electric cars. The walkable neighborhood has it beat, hands down. So it's the most affordable way of reducing emissions, and it has the most significant effect on emissions than any other single activity that we could engage in. So for those people who work really hard to recycle and get all the right light bulb fixtures in their fixtures, and feel like they're just making a drop in the bucket, well, here's something that we can do that makes all of our lives better, that makes a huge difference for the environment. On top of that, our 3D modeling, we've used our 3D modeling as a tool to assess the end patterns, so the resulting neighborhood patterns, and to calculate, for example, how much hard surface is left at the end. And there's a significant reduction in the amount of hard surface. And that is a very significant in environmental terms, particularly when it comes to water management and the regulating the city's heat.
So what do you mean by hard surfaces?
Hard surfaces, paved areas or rooftops.
Okay. So driveways, walkways, interlock.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if we have more soft surface and more trees, then the environment, the heat island effect of our city is really significantly reduced, and our urban tree canopy is expanding. Our urban tree canopy is one of our big goals right now as a city, to get our tree canopy up to 40%. And the more we pave, the less opportunity we have for trees. So having a path in place for our neighborhoods to transition such that we can have a lot more soft surface is really important. And Ottawa's commit to going carbon neutral by 2050. And when we say carbon neutral, we mean for all of the carbon we haven't eliminated from our lifestyles, we will offset by paying into green programs. And so we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars being spent to offset the emissions that we're still producing. Walkable neighborhoods simply reduce the emissions. And so the end result is an enormous cost savings for the city.
And I guess within this year with the pandemic, people have spent more time at home, more time in their communities, more time walking around the streets of their adjacent area where they would spend maybe commuting in a car to work. So it is very top of mind for people to kind of decide now in terms, what do they want their neighborhoods to look like? And that can be a very exciting process. But the environmental benefits that you're speaking of are kind of contrary to what people would normally believe, that by tearing down certain houses and rebuilding more density, that seems to be going against the shift.
Yeah, people think that often that intensification is bad for the environment, and react against new development. And so having this modeling in place is helpful for people to get a clear sense of what the future of their neighborhood could look like. And then for us also to start making decisions based on our vision rather than consulting and making decisions based on what we think would be a nice change right now. You got to get all those pieces in place and see them together and look at the end result and then decide, I think, collaboratively, is this the right choice for us? Instead of just kind of one-off decisions. How about electric cars? Ooh, that sounds good. Well, no, let's have the full picture here.
How do we create that unified vision for a walkable city? If there is direction from the city and the planning department to go towards 15-minute communities, how do we all buy in, all different stakeholders into that one unified vision?
Well, we're doing it right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's a time-consuming process. It means, though, that we need to get the right people at the table for the right conversations and to be very deliberate, because the project falls apart when one piece is missing. So an example would be conversations with small business owners. We've discovered that small commercial veins running through neighborhoods aren't going to happen and into today's environment for a whole variety of reasons, more than just a lack of density and shoppers. There are a lot of prohibitive regulations. The way that small commercial is being included, even where it is allowed by zoning, the specifics of the zoning make it really not quite work out. And so as we pick through those pieces, we realize that it's so important for all of us collaborating together to support our small business members and to make sure that those pieces are taken care of, because it's for the benefit of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So really working together and advocating for each other and with each other is really important.
Mm-hmm.
But none of us are able, I think, to understand our own piece in the puzzle until we bring the vision together as a whole. So there's certainly a lot of back and forth going on in this process of vision building with Walkable Ottawa, as we kind of put forward a vision, find out what pieces are missing, take it back again, try and fill in the gaps with the help of our collaborators, put the vision back out there, and get more feedback.
Mm-hmm. And what's your ultimate objective through Walkable Ottawa?
We want to change our neighborhoods.
And change your neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so achievable.
Mm-hmm.
This is the opportunity of a lifetime for our neighborhoods. Also, this is a moment of great need. So unlike the pandemic, the crises of our neighborhoods have snuck up on us.
Mm-hmm.
So, the pandemic is really top of mind because it hit us hard, and it's changed things really dramatically all of a sudden. But the kind of crises that we experience in our neighborhoods, there's three. So environmental crisis, housing affordability crisis, and what some people call an epidemic of loneliness.
Mm.
Those three problems have snuck up on us. So it's that kind of lobster in the lobster pot kind of scenario, where we all know there's problems, but we've kind of, we've sunk into them. Yeah. But now with our new official plan is an opportunity to actually really set ourselves back on track on a new course that can correct all of those things with respect to our neighborhoods,
Mm-hmm.
our existing neighborhoods. And because we're not working with a blank slate here,
Yeah.
it does mean a lot more collaboration. If we were just starting a city over again, that'd be a different game altogether.
Mm-hmm. What existing barriers do you find to walkability?
There's a number of things in our existing neighborhoods that are barriers that you see repeating neighborhood to neighborhood in Ottawa.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly, it's that our neighborhoods require us to live car-dependent lives on the whole. So if you want to become, an urban cyclist and let go of your car, it's really hard in most neighborhoods. There aren't, the neighborhoods simply aren't complete. So that your choice to live differently isn't there. On top of that, most neighborhoods have some barriers that are sort of functional. So places that pedestrians can't cross and cyclists can't cross. Physical barriers. Sometimes the barrier is a very busy street that divides a neighborhood into two pieces from the perspective of a cyclist or a pedestrian. Some of those barriers are quirky little things that only people in the neighborhood would understand. So I'll give you my example. That between me and my neighborhood grocery store, there's a concrete stairwell that is nasty and stinky. And there's a reason why people will drive around to the grocery store rather than walk up that stairwell. So lots of neighborhoods have lots of little barriers and lots of big systemic barriers.
So within the context of some of the 3D modeling that you've done so far, it introduces a bit more of a variety of housing stock, which we haven't really seen in the city. As myself, as a real estate agent, you notice certain patterns like the ones that you've noticed, and some of these semi-detached options are prevalent but not affordable and achievable for most people. And the prices have gone up substantially this year, probably by the end of the year will be somewhere between 15 and 20%. A lot of the younger generation coming into the market simply can't afford to live within urban Ottawa and are going to municipalities outside of Ottawa to meet those housing solutions. So within some of the changes that we're looking for, hopefully it will introduce a bit more wide variety of units within the marketplace that can meet the needs of the average person as they're making their way through the community. So from, single first-time young professional to young families to older citizens. So I see here that you have a few examples of a few dwellings that have converted over time.
Yeah, well, this is the same 3D model you saw before, but broken in half so that you see the right side of the street and the left side of the street.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows exactly what I changed on the street in order to produce those images. And if you look to the image showing the right side of the street, you'll see that the first line is the street as it exists now. And again, this isn't an actual street. It's kind of a combination of streets, but this is our example street. And in the second row, you'll see after 10 years, some of the change that's taken place. So one of the smaller houses has been taken down and replaced with a temporary parking lot. Another has been replaced with a park. And a third has been replaced with a multi-unit development. 2 buildings containing a total of 8 units. And then in the third line, you'll see that time has passed. The trees have grown up, so there's a lovely tree canopy along the street now. The parking lot is no longer needed because the neighborhood has become walkable, and it has been replaced with another small multi-unit building. The end result is that this little piece of street has almost doubled in density. So there's almost twice as many people living on that street. In contrast, if you took our existing development patterns and projected them forward in time, you would see a very minimal increase in population. So the actual buildings that have been introduced onto this street, though, they fit in because they're the same kind of size as the other stuff that's already on the street. But they're different in that they can contain whatever mix of dwelling units is appropriate. So a regulation that would allow a builder to build an appropriately sized building, but fill it to meet market demand, it's really key to get the right mix of units, right? If developers are being dictated to exactly the kinds of units that they can put into a building, then the result that we're seeing right now is that they're not building to meet market demand, and that they're the smaller households and the households who have a lower income to spend on their household or their housing needs simply aren't having their need met.
Mm-hmm.
And so this approach to regulation would be very different, and it would open up lots of opportunities for housing for a wider variety of people. So more people could find housing in the inner neighborhoods.
Is there a certain threshold between the number of units that makes it challenging now to increase the density within a neighborhood? Does it fall at 3 or 4 or 6 units?
Well, there are regulatory thresholds, and that's something that needs to change as well. So though some neighborhoods, small apartment buildings are permitted, they're often not built, because once you pass a threshold from 3 units to 4 units, all sorts of other requirements, application processes, and costs kick in, so that the the kinds of buildings we would like to see come into our neighborhoods are not coming because it just doesn't make sense to build them. So our regulations are sometimes not technically prohibiting the kind of development we want,
Mm-hmm.
but to all practical intents and purposes, prohibiting it
Mm-hmm.
because a developer isn't able to make a business model out of it
So
in the
how do
way
you
that they're
regulate
regulated.
that then? If certain buildings are permitted now but aren't part of the everyday types of developments that happens in neighborhoods, how do we encourage those types of buildings to be built given that we really need them within the urban neighborhoods?
Yeah. So that's where collaboration comes in.
Mm-hmm.
One important piece of that question is first understanding what it is that we want. And neighbors have been very helpful in communicating the kinds of buildings that fit well in their neighborhood. They've shared with us ideas about buildings that are interesting on the front, animated with people spaces out front, so they're interesting to walk past and make their walk down the street more interesting. And buildings that have volumes and spacing that fits in with the existing pattern that they see along the street. And then when we collaborate with developers and builders, we can understand, well, those kinds of features can be achieved if the regulations were changed and they've been able to provide very specific explanations of exactly what regulations would need to change and in what ways. Not just the rules themselves, like the rules of zoning, but some of the application processes, the ways that fees are structured. So for example, development charges on dwelling units are structured to advantage larger units over smaller units. And so we'll advocate that they be restructured so as not to influence the choice one way or another, so that instead the choice is guided by need and demand,
Mm-hmm.
market demand.
Okay. And part of transitioning walkable neighborhoods is to make sure that the amenities are there within that fabric of that community. Can you speak about some of the improvements to parks and recreational space for the residents within those areas?
Sure. It's important that community members are engaged in that conversation because every community is different. Every community has particularities in the way that it's physically organized and the people that are a part of it. So we've been working to provide tools to community associations and to our other collaborators in order to more quickly understand their options in filling in some of the missing pieces. So this is the slide now shows the park options that we've been working on. So it's a bit of a cheat sheet for the kinds of parks that you could insert into your existing neighborhood to bring it up to completeness as your density or your population increases. Your neighborhood might need more community or children's gardens, more community-based activity spaces. It might need simply just more open space for sports and recreation. Sometimes there's opportunities for little pieces of park here and there, sometimes on private property. And so we show an example where that's actually happened in the Glebe. And some neighborhoods really need the purchase of new land for parkettes within the neighborhood fabric so that there's enough play space for kids.
Mm-hmm.
So with parks, community spaces, and other elements of the puzzle, we're preparing sheets like this that can help community associations to quickly identify solutions to fill out their neighborhood to completeness.
Because it's not just a question of zoning bylaws and tweaking the height, the number of density, or the specific rules. I find the interesting part about creating walkable neighborhood and walkable Ottawa is that it encompasses a bunch of different facets of day-to-day life. So it encompasses obviously the four walls within the plot of land that you work on, but also some of the public facilities in terms of sidewalks, in terms of benches, like we've spoken about, in terms of public washrooms, in terms of parks. So it falls into, I guess, more of a holistic view outside of just one specific housing. So I
Right.
guess what's in it for the average resident of Ottawa? Why should they care? There's so many things going on, and why should they focus their intention on this specific issue around transitioning their neighborhoods?
Well, the neighborhoods that we live in now, we love. Many of us adore our neighborhoods. They're our homes. And as our homes, we could do better. We deserve to live in neighborhoods where we can make choices about how we move, where we could choose to walk around the corner to a beautiful little bakery and buy our breakfast. It's a real option that we could all have that. And it's a great opportunity for all of us. If we transitioned our existing neighborhoods to become walkable, we would all be much healthier. Reports on walkable neighborhoods demonstrate that people's self-professed levels of happiness are much higher. So if you give up commuting and start walking to your job, your level of happiness increases the same amount as if you fell in love. This stuff is big, and it makes a huge difference in our lives. We would all be happier with more trees, more parks, more small shops around the corner, a more interesting and dynamic neighborhood.
If we build it, they will come in some respects. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Rosaline.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Very interesting spending time and learning more about these issues, and look forward to transitioning our mature neighborhoods for generations to come.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. Thank you for joining us on the latest episode of the Walkable Ottawa podcast. If you want to keep up on our progress, make sure to follow us on social media at Walkable Ottawa, as well as visit our website for more information at walkableottawa.ca. If you don't want to miss the next episode, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Thank you.